Lucas returned home from his business trip 2 days earlier than planned. For him, home was always more than just a place to live. It was his stronghold, a source of peace and inspiration. Here he felt protected. Here he could throw off the burden of work and dissolve in an atmosphere of comfort. He always loved this moment when he opened the door and was greeted by joyful voices. Luna threw herself on his neck, Theo squealed with delight, and Sophia hugged him with a smile on her lips. At such moments he felt truly alive. These moments were worth all the long flights and hours of work. In this house, he loved to spend evenings playing board games with the children, telling Luna stories before bed, and playing superheroes with Theo. He loved the way Sophia laughed at his ridiculous jokes while cooking, how she sometimes sneaks glances at him with the same warmth that she had at the beginning of their relationship. This house breathes with memories and happiness, and that is why Lucas was especially looking forward to returning, anticipating a cozy evening with his family. As soon as he entered the house, he was struck by the unusual silence. There was no smell of dinner, no fresh spices, no fried meat, not even the coffee that Sophia usually brewed for his return. Deaf silence and a strange emptiness filled the space, making him wary. He placed his bag at the entrance and looked around. Everything looked as it should, but something was missing. He listened. The house was too quiet. No one ran out to him with hugs, no joyful cries were heard. Lucas was about to call his family when he heard light, almost inaudible steps. A moment later, Theo, his 4-year-old son, appeared around the corner. The boy froze for a second, as if surprised by the unexpected appearance of his father, and then rushed towards him with an enthusiastic cry. "Dad!" Theo wrapped his small arms around his legs. Lucas knelt down, hugged his son tightly, and laughed with happiness. At that moment, Luna appeared in the hall. The teenage girl smiled and slowly approached, hugging her father a little more reservedly, but with the same warmth. "You should have come back later," she said, but there was joy in her voice. "I wanted to surprise you," Lucas grinned, stroking her head. Lucas finally took off his coat and walked deeper into the house, enjoying the long-awaited comfort. Theo had already returned to his toys, enthusiastically moving the little cars across the carpet, but Luna remained standing in place. Her hands clenched nervously into fists and her eyes darted around the room, as if she didn't know what to say or how to behave. "Lou, what happened?" Lucas asked, tilting his head and peering into her face. Usually cheerful and talkative, today she seemed distant. "You're kind of quiet." Luna shrugged her shoulders nervously, lowered her eyes, and muttered quietly, "It's okay, I'm just tired." But her voice sounded tense, and her long fingers fiddled with the edge of her sleeve. Lucas frowned, feeling a slight chill of worry. "Where is Mom?" he asked, hoping to hear something familiar, like "in the kitchen" or "in the bedroom." Luna hesitated for a second before blurting out, "She went to see her friend." Lucas narrowed his eyes. Sophia never left the children alone in the evenings, especially Theo, who was too young to be left unattended. Moreover, she always warned him about such exits. It was strange, unusual. Something didn't fit in his head. "Which friend?" he asked, trying to speak calmly. Luna nervously tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and shrugged. She didn't say. She just said she'd be back later. Lucas exhaled slowly, feeling anxiety rising within him. He looked around the room. Everything looked normal, but now the house seemed empty, too quiet. The evening, which should have been warm and joyful, suddenly took on a tinge of something wrong. He ran his hand through his hair, straightened up, and looked at his daughter. Luna avoided his gaze, her fingers still nervously fiddling with her sleeve. "Okay," he said, deciding not to press it yet. "Are you sure you're okay?" She nodded, but the expression on her face told a different story. Lucas picked up the phone and dialed Sophia's number. Horns, 123. There was no answer. Lucas looked carefully at Luna. She continued to fiddle with the sleeves of her sweater, lowering her gaze whenever he tried to catch her eyes. Her breathing was uneven, and her shoulders trembled subtly. Something was clearly wrong, but she was in no hurry to share it with him. "Have you even had dinner?" he asked, trying to make his voice sound soft without tension. Luna shrugged her shoulders and nodded uncertainty. I ate a little. Theo was eating cereal. Lucas frowned. Usually Sophia prepared a full dinner for the children, even if he was not at home. More than once he had to return from work and find a dish covered with a towel on the stove. It was her little concern, her way of saying that she was waiting for him. But today the house seemed cold, not only physically, but also on an emotional level. He took a deep breath, trying to rid himself of his growing anxiety, and headed towards the kitchen. As soon as he entered, his instincts told him that something was wrong. It was dark here. Only the dim light from the corridor illuminated the space a little. He turned on the lamp above the stove, and yellow light spread throughout the room, but instead of comfort, it emphasized emptiness. There was no familiar smell of food, spices, or something warm that usually lingered in the air after dinner. The table was empty, no dirty plates, no signs of a recent meal. The refrigerator, however, looked even stranger. Lucas opened the door and froze. Almost complete emptiness. A few yogurts, a lone bottle of water, a few pieces of sliced cheese, and a half-empty bottle of wine. He frowned. Sophia rarely drank alone, especially wine. She always said that alcohol for her is part of the holiday that she likes to share with him or with friends. Feeling an unpleasant chill along his spine, he ran his finger along the neck of the bottle. It was sticky, as if someone had recently poured wine and spilled a few drops. He looked at the tabletop, but there were no glasses. Either she drank straight from the bottle, or someone removed traces of her dinner. Lucas felt a little dizzy. This detail seemed wrong to him. A bottle of wine alone, an almost empty refrigerator. Something was happening behind him, and he couldn't understand what. He turned around and saw Luna standing in the kitchen doorway without going inside. She looked at him, clearly not daring to say anything important. There was concern on her face. "Are you sure everything is okay?" he asked, holding her gaze. Luna bit her lip, thought for a second, and then nodded. "Yes, Papa. Everything is fine." But Lucas wasn't sure about that. He felt anxiety slowly rising in his chest. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. He walked around the kitchen, looked into the sink. It was empty. No dirty plates, no traces of food. Usually Sophia left some little things behind after cooking, a cutting board, a knife, a ladle. But now everything was too clean, as if no one had cooked. His gaze slid back to the moon. She still stood in the doorway, clearly waiting for him to say something. Lucas was still trying to comprehend the strange situation with the empty refrigerator and wine when Luna carefully shifted from foot to foot and said quietly, "Dad, don't be angry, but it seems to me that Mom is not dating her friend." There was deathly silence in the room. Lucas felt something clench inside him. His breathing became labored and his ears began to ring. He turned sharply to his daughter. His voice sounded loud and unexpectedly sharp. "What did you say?" Luna shuddered, her eyes filled with fear, and she automatically took a step back. Lucas immediately realized that he had gone too far, but he could no longer restrain himself. His hands clenched into fists, and hundreds of thoughts flashed through his head. The girl hesitantly bit her lip, as if she was afraid to speak further, but, seeing that her father was not taking his demanding gaze away from her, she quietly continued. I saw my mother with some man, a few days ago. She said she was going to the store, but I accidentally saw her through the window. She got into the car, and there he was. They went somewhere together." Lucas felt his chest tighten with a sudden rush of emotion. Everything inside him demanded answers. Lucas clenched his jaw, trying to maintain composure, but everything was raging inside him. My heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to jump out of my chest. His palms were sweaty and his muscles tensed as if he were preparing to strike. He looked at Luna, who was clearly nervous, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sweater, and her eyes were shining with suppressed tears. "Are you sure?" His voice was tense, like a stretched string ready to burst. Luna nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "Yes, Dad. I saw him arrive. He was driving a black car. Mom came out to him. They talked about something, and she laughed. Then she sat down with him, and they left. Luna spoke each word slowly, as if testing her father's reaction, fearing his outburst of anger. Lucas felt the rage growing inside him, but even stronger was the feeling of icy horror. He swallowed the lump in his throat and asked, "When was this?" Luna looked away, as if she didn't want to talk, but then she answered, "Several times. Last time. Last night." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. Last night. At that moment, when he was in another city, he called Sophia, but she did not pick up the phone. His fingers clenched into fists, his nails dug into his palms, but he didn't even feel it. "Are you sure you weren't mistaken? Maybe it's just a friend or colleague. Maybe it just seemed to you." His voice sounded tense, almost pleading. He wanted to cling to some hope that this was all just a misunderstanding. Luna sobbed. Her shoulders shook and tears appeared in her eyes. She looked at her father silently for several long seconds, her lower lip trembling. Then, without saying a word, she turned away and walked briskly to her room. Lucas stood there, unable to move. He heard the door slam behind him, and Luna probably fell onto the bed, covering her face with her hands. He knew she was scared, and he was also afraid not of what he heard from his daughter, but of what it could mean. Slowly, he sank into a chair. His fingers tapped nervously on the tabletop. He remembered how Sophia said that she loved him, that they were family, that nothing would separate them. And now he felt his world coming apart at the seams. There was a noise in his ears, and it seemed to him that the walls of the house were pressing on him. He ran his hand over his face, trying to collect his thoughts. Take a deep breath. Exhalation. What now? He had to do something. Had to find out the truth. Lucas never doubted Sophia. In all the years of their life together, the thought that she might betray him had never even occurred to him. Their marriage was strong, filled with trust, love, and mutual respect. He was always proud of their relationship, their ability to talk, solve problems, and support each other through difficult times. And now this trust was crumbling before our eyes, leaving behind only cold devastation. He lowered his head, feeling his thoughts taking him back to the past. Lucas remembered the day he first met Sophia. It was summer, hot and muggy, when he had just moved to the city for a new job. He went into a small cafe hidden between two high-rise buildings to take a break and drink a cup of coffee. And there she was smiling, lively, with sparkles in her eyes that immediately attracted his attention. Sophia worked there as a waitress, and when she approached his table, he suddenly felt that this moment would change his life. "What will you order?" she asked, looking at him with a slight smile. "Coffee, black," he muttered, suddenly embarrassed under her gaze. She laughed, mistaking his confusion for ordinary fatigue, and a couple of minutes later, she brought him a hot cup. But their communication did not end there. He returned there the next day, and again, and one more thing. After a couple of weeks, he realized that he was going to this cafe not so much for the coffee, but for her. They began to talk more and more. He learned about her dreams, about her love for books, about how she wanted to travel, but could not afford it yet. And then there was their first evening together. He invited her to dinner, and they talked until late at night, walking along the embankment. At that moment, he realized that he had fallen in love. Sophia was the one with whom he wanted to spend his whole life. Lucas remembered their wedding day. It was one of the happiest moments in his life. Sophia looked dazzling in her white dress, her eyes shining with love and happiness. They stood in front of the altar, holding hands, and he felt a warmth spread inside him as she said her vows. Then it seemed to him that nothing could destroy their union, that they would have a long and happy life together. But already in the first year of marriage, they encountered difficulties. Sophia left her job in a cafe and tried to find herself in a new business. She rushed between different options. She wanted to open her own small bakery. Then she became interested in photography. Then she tried herself in graphic design. Each of her attempts ended in disappointment, and Lucas saw her enthusiasm gradually fade away. It hurt him to watch her doubt herself, but he always supported her, saying that sooner or later she would find something that she truly liked. Financial problems were also not long in coming. Lucas worked as a programmer and made good money, but their expenses were growing. Rented housing, bills, Sophia's dreams of her own business, all this fell on his shoulders. He didn't complain, but sometimes he felt tired. Sophia noticed this too. At times they quarreled over money, but then they made up, realizing that they loved each other and wanted to be together, no matter what. And then the moon appeared, their first daughter. The birth of a child was a challenge, but also a great happiness. Sophia dedicated herself to motherhood, but Lucas saw that she sometimes felt lonely. He tried to help and spent as much time as possible with his daughter, but there was more and more work and less free time. Sophia began to complain that he was not paying enough attention to her. In those moments, he felt guilty, but did not know how to change the situation. Then they got Theo. The second child added even more worries. Sophia often did not get enough sleep and was tired, and Lucas was immersed in work. They talked less and less about anything other than children, everyday problems, and finances. In the evenings, Sophia often fell asleep on the sofa, and Lucas remained alone at the computer, finishing projects. He felt that their marriage began to lose the lightness that it had at the beginning, but continued to believe that this was temporary. Sometimes they still found time for themselves. Weekends in the park, trips to the sea, rare evenings together. At such moments, he again saw in Sophia the girl with whom he fell in love. But such moments happened less and less often. Lucas sighed heavily. They went through so many difficulties back then, but they always found a way to cope. Why is everything falling apart now? What has changed? He tried to find an answer, but only one word sounded in his head: why? Lucas knew he needed to find out the truth, and do it quickly. He couldn't afford to sit idly by and wait for everything to clear up on its own. Sophia never showed up at home and did not answer calls or messages. His mind raced for explanations, but none seemed convincing. The night passed in anxiety and worry. Lucas barely slept a wink, tossing and turning in bed, listening to every rustle, hoping to hear the sound of the door opening. But the house remained silent. He mentally replayed his daughter's words over and over again, but didn't want to jump to conclusions. He must check everything himself. In the morning, when Luna was getting ready for school, Lucas was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee. He watched as his daughter hurriedly threw textbooks into her backpack and straightened her hair in front of the mirror. She didn't say a word about yesterday's conversation, but tension was visible in her movements. Her eyes avoided his gaze. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. Luna froze for a second, then nodded. "Yes. Okay." But Lucas knew that wasn't the case. He felt that she was also worried, but did not want to talk about it. When the door closed behind his daughter, he took a deep breath and clenched his fingers into fists. He needs to act. He couldn't let his fears control him. He took out his phone, opened his contact list, and wondered where to start. He knew that Sophia couldn't just disappear. Where was she? With whom? And why didn't she say a word? Lucas decided that today he would find out the truth, no matter the cost. When the door closed behind his daughter, Lucas knew he couldn't hesitate any longer. He had to find out the truth, and the first step was to find out who the man Luna had seen was. He was haunted by the detail his daughter told him about, the black car. This could be the key. Sophia clearly did not suspect that anyone had seen her, and if the car really came several times, it means that it could have been recorded by surveillance cameras in the yard. Lucas remembered that the management company in charge of the video surveillance was located in a neighboring house. He had already encountered problems with their staff when he had problems with the parking space a few months ago. Then he found a common language with the administrator, and this could play into his hands. He quickly put on his jacket, grabbed his phone, and went outside. The cool morning air refreshed him a little, but everything inside was clenched with tension. He had to act quickly and carefully. If Sophia is cheating on him, he should find out for himself and not speculate based on his daughter's words. As Lucas approached the management company's office, he thought about what he would say. He couldn't just show up and demand a recording. It was necessary to show cunning, to use the trust that he had once gained. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Lucas knew that the only way to gain access to the records was to enlist the help of the guard. He had crossed paths with him before, and he seemed like someone who could help if he was persuaded correctly. Rising to the second floor of the management company building, he knocked on the security door. A few seconds later, the door opened to reveal an elderly man wearing a uniform jacket with a company badge. "Good morning, Henry," Lucas said, trying to look calm even though he was seething inside. "I have a small request. Can I talk?" Henry narrowed his eyes, clearly wary, but nodded and let him inside. The small room was littered with monitors that showed cameras from the courtyard and entrances. There was an old sofa in the corner, littered with magazines and some papers. The air smelled of strong coffee and tobacco smoke. "What's the matter?" asked the watchman, crossing his arms over his chest. Lucas quickly came up with a plausible explanation. "One person came to our house several times, and I want to make sure that it is not someone suspicious. My daughter saw it, but couldn't remember the numbers. I just need to look at the records." Henry looked at him doubtfully, tapped his fingers on the table, then sighed and waved his hand. "Okay, but only for a while. The cameras do not record sound, only images. I hope you understand." Lucas nodded, sat down at the monitor, and began looking through the recordings. Minutes turned into hours. My eyes began to get tired from constantly watching the movement of cars, people, and headlights. He rewound back and forth, peering at the flashing frames. It seemed that the right moment was slipping away. And finally, he saw what he was looking for. The same car appeared on the screen, black, with tinted windows. She pulled up to their house, and a few seconds later the door opened. Sophia came out of the entrance, looked around, then smiled and walked up to the car. Lucas held his breath. He watched his wife talking to the driver, leaning towards the window, laughing. Then she opened the door and sat inside. Her hand gently slid over the man's shoulder. She said something, and they both laughed. However, the man's face remained in shadow, hidden by the camera angle. Lucas stopped the recording and tried to zoom in, but the video quality left much to be desired. He pressed play again, watching every movement. The car stood at the entrance for a few more minutes before smoothly driving away. Henry leaned towards the screen, glanced sideways at Lucas, and muttered, "It looks like your wife isn't just going out to meet a friend." Lucas's heart began to beat wildly, as if a hammer had hit his chest. Now he had evidence, but it fell on him like an avalanche, overwhelming him with cold horror. All that remains is to find out who this man is, who was with his wife, who caused this betrayal. He straightened up, but the feeling of heaviness inside did not disappear. It seemed that the air around him had become thick and heavy, and the walls were compressing, pressing on him from all sides. His world, which he considered strong and indestructible, began to crack at the seams, crumbling into the abyss. He couldn't just leave it like that. Fury mixed with pain bubbled in my chest. Questions stuck in his head, not giving him a second of peace. Who is this man? How long has this been going on? Why was Sophia smiling at him the way she had only ever smiled at Lucas? He needed to know the truth, as quickly as possible, and he wasn't going to stop until he got answers. Lucas took a copy of the video from Henry and quickly walked home. His fingers gripped the flash drive tightly, as if it were the key to a solution that would turn his life around. His thoughts were confused, his heart was pounding. He could no longer deny the obvious Sophia was hiding something. But now he was ready to find out. When he returned home, the apartment greeted him with cold silence. Lucas walked into the living room, threw his jacket over the back of the couch, and sat down at the table. He inserted the flash drive into the laptop, launched the video, and carefully watched the recording again. He rewinded it several times, looking at the details. At some point, the camera caught an important moment for a few seconds. The headlights illuminated the front license plate of the car. "Here it is, a clue." Lucas froze, taking a deep breath. Now he had something concrete: car license plates. This was his weapon. If he recognizes the owner, he might finally be able to figure out who his wife has been seeing behind his back. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts list. Finally, I found the right name, Mike Connors, a former colleague and now a private detective with good connections in the police. If anyone could quickly punch a car's license plate number, it was him. "Mike, this is Lucas. I need your help," he said, barely collecting his thoughts. "Why so official?" Mike grinned. "Did something happen?" Lucas clenched his fist, fighting the storm of emotions. "Yes, I need to find out the owner of the car. I'll text you the number. This is important." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Mike answered seriously. "Fine. Throw it away. I'll give you an answer as soon as I find something." Lucas sent him a photo of the screen and sat back in his chair. Now all that was left was to wait. A plan began to form in my head. Sophia was supposed to return from work in the late afternoon. He wasn't going to make a scene until he had all the information. But he knew one thing for sure: he would not allow himself to be treated like a fool. It was only a couple of hours, but for Lucas it felt like an eternity. He couldn't concentrate on anything, looking at his phone every now and then, waiting for a call from Mike. When the device finally vibrated, Lucas instantly grabbed it and brought it to his ear. "Yes?" His voice was tense. "Lucas, this is Mike." A serious voice came over the phone. "I rang the number as you asked. The car is registered to a man named Richard Davis. I am 42 years old, married, 2 children." Lucas clenched the phone in his hand until his knuckles turned white. He had expected something like this, but hearing it out loud was a shock. "You are sure?" His voice became hoarse. "Absolutely. I checked it several times. He owns a small construction company. No criminal record, but a fairly wealthy man. I'm not sure what you wanted to hear, but that's all I have on him." Lucas ran his hand over his face, trying to process what he had heard. This man had a family, wife, children, and at the same time he met with Sophia. Anger mixed with pain began to boil in my chest. "Thanks, Mike," he said dully. "That's exactly what I needed to know." "If anything happens, keep me posted," Mike replied. "And Lucas, be careful." Lucas turned off the call and stared at one point. Now he had the truth, and he was going to act. Lucas looked at the phone screen, replaying what he had heard in his head. The name Richard Davis meant nothing to him. He was just a man, one of millions, and he needed to know more about him. He took the laptop, opened the browser, and began typing the name into the search engine. The first results were standard social media profiles, a few news items, mentions in local business directories. But he was not going to stop at superficial data. He opened the website of Richard Davis's company. It turned out that he owns a small construction company that deals with luxury houses. The page contained photographs of his projects, interviews with him, in which he talked about his working principles and love for quality. Lucas continued to dig. A few minutes later, he found Davis's profile on one of the social networks. Family photos, pictures from corporate events, publications about business. At first glance, he is an exemplary family man and a successful entrepreneur. But now Lucas knew there was something more behind that picture. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank screen. Thoughts swirled chaotically in his head. What could this man give to Sophia that he, Lucas, could not? Didn't he care about her? Didn't he provide for the family? Wasn't he there when she needed support? What was it about this man that made her betray their years of marriage? Lucas clenched his fists, feeling a painful emptiness inside him. His heart ached at the thought that perhaps he had missed something important, something that Sophia had never told him out loud. Was it boredom, thirst for new emotions, or did he simply become invisible to her, a person who was taken for granted? He ran his hand over his face, trying to collect his thoughts, but the feeling of injustice only grew inside him. He needed to find an answer, to understand what went wrong. Because if he doesn't figure it out now, he won't be able to live on. He won't be able to get rid of this aching pain in his chest. His fingers quickly typed the new name into the search bar. He felt that he was approaching something important. Now he needed to put all the pieces of the puzzle together and understand what role Richard Davis played in his life. Sophia entered the house, slammed the door, and tiredly threw off her coat. There was an unusual silence in the hallway, which sent a chill down her spine. She expected an empty house because Lucas was due back later. But when she entered the kitchen and saw his silhouette sitting in the dark, everything inside her sank. "God, Lucas, you scared me," she said, putting her bag on the table. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" He didn't answer immediately. An unfinished cup of coffee stood on the table in front of him, his fingers slowly sliding along the edge of the mug. Sophia felt her heart beat faster. Something was wrong. "How was your day?" he finally asked. His voice sounded even, but there was tension in it. Sophia froze for a moment, then pulled herself together and shrugged. "An ordinary day. There was a lot of work. And you were supposed to come back later." Lucas nodded, although there was no hint of relaxation in his eyes. "I decided to come earlier. I wanted to spend more time with my family." His voice sounded calm, but there was a feeling of an impending storm in the air. Sophia went to the refrigerator to pour herself some water, but felt his gaze boring into her back. Her fingers trembled as she took the glass. "You look tired," Lucas continued, not taking his eyes off her. "Long day?" "Yes," she nodded, swallowing water and trying not to look into his eyes. "The clients today were simply unbearable." He ran his finger along the edge of the mug again, as if weighing something in his head. "Interesting," he drawled. "I thought you were with a friend." Sophia froze. For a moment her face lost color, but then she quickly pulled herself together. "What? What are you talking about?" Lucas slowly rose from the table, and his shadow stretched across the kitchen floor. Sophia's heart sank with the premonition that this evening would be a turning point. Lucas crossed his arms and took a step forward. The light from the hallway barely illuminated his face, but Sophia felt his gaze, which burned right through her. She clenched her fingers, forcing herself to look calm, but inside she was seething. "Which friend did you visit yesterday?" His voice sounded low and slow, as if he was choosing every word carefully. Sophia blinked and straightened up, trying to look calm. "Olivia's," she answered, smiling faintly. "We drank tea, talked about everything, as usual." Lucas nodded, but there was no faith in his gaze. He slowly ran his hand over his chin, as if thinking about something important. "Olivia, that means," he drawled, taking a step towards the table. "This is weird." Sophia swallowed, her heart suddenly beating faster. She knew that tone even, but filled with something icy. The tone of someone who already knows the answer. "Why is it strange?" Her voice trembled, and she immediately regretted it. Lucas leaned on the table, studying her face. "Because I saw the surveillance cameras," he said calmly, but in this calm manner there was a feeling of contained storm. "I saw you leave the house and get into a black SUV." Sophia froze. Time seemed to stand still. My chest tightened and my breathing became ragged. Her mind was feverishly searching for a way out, an excuse, something to say. "Black SUV?" she asked, trying to smile, but her lips were trembling. "Olivia, maybe she." Olivia started driving a black SUV. Lucas interrupted her, his voice becoming harder. He watched as the color slowly drained from her face. Sophia tried to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. She looked like she had just been pinned against a wall with no way out. There was tension in the air. Lucas didn't look away, waiting for her next move. This was the moment of truth. Sophia opened her mouth, trying to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. She knew that every careless word could make the situation worse, but her mind was desperately looking for a way out. Lips trembled, hands clenched into fists, but nothing plausible came to mind. Lucas didn't rush her. He sat silently opposite, leaning his elbows on the table. A tense silence hung in the room, broken only by the muffled sound of the clock on the wall. His eyes were cold and attentive, as if he read her thoughts, knew what she would say before she had time to voice it. Sophia swallowed, took a deep breath, and finally whispered, "It's just a colleague. He gave me a ride home." Lucas nodded, as if expecting this answer. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, took out a small flash drive, and carefully placed it on the table. She looked harmless, but Sophia felt her stomach tighten. "Look at this," his voice was smooth, but there was steel in it. "And then tell me again that it doesn't mean anything." Sophia looked at the flash drive as if it were a snake's sting. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She was afraid. I was afraid of what was written there, afraid to see myself from the outside, without the ability to deny the obvious. Lucas took the laptop, turned it on, and inserted the flash drive into the slot. The screen remained dark for a few seconds, then a video appeared. Black and white recording of the yard, soft light from the lanterns, the entrance door. She saw herself from the outside, how she got out, how she stood, looking around, how she smiled at the man behind the wheel. Then she takes a step forward, rests her hand on the car door, her fingers sliding along the driver's shoulder. Her face expresses warmth, trust, something that leaves no room for excuses. Sophia clenched her teeth, her breathing becoming ragged. "Lucas," she began, but her voice was shaking. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, and looked at her. He waited. I was waiting for her to tell the truth. Sophia was breathing heavily and irregularly. Her hands were shaking. She felt like the world was collapsing around her, but she tried to grab at least some straw. She looked at Lucas with pleading eyes, but his gaze was cold as ice. Her heart was beating so hard that she could hear it rumbling in her ears. She understood that words could either save her or completely destroy everything. "It's not what you think," she blurted out, her voice trembling, and there was panic in it. "I swear to you, Lucas, this is just a ridiculous situation." Lucas chuckled, bitter, evil. "Not what I think," he repeated, rising from the table. Suddenly, his voice exploded with anger, like a thunderclap. "Are you saying it was just a trip? Friendly gesture? Then why are you patting him on the shoulder? Why do you look like he's your damn savior?" Sophia closed her eyes, her lips trembled, and she felt a cold sweat run down her back. She knew he wouldn't calm down, that he cannot be convinced with words alone. "Lucas, please." "What?" He took a sharp step towards her, and she involuntarily recoiled. "Are you saying that I'm wrong? That all these records, all this damn evidence are just a coincidence?" He ran his hand through his hair furiously, trying to pull himself together, but it was impossible. There was a noise in my head. My chest was bursting with rage, pain, and a feeling of betrayal. His hands were shaking with tension. "I gave you everything, Sophia," he hissed, his voice breaking into a hoarse whisper. "All. I worked. I took care of us. I trusted you. And you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she bit her lip nervously. "That's not true, Lucas. Isn't that right?" He laughed, but this laugh was full of bitterness. "Do you think I'm an idiot? Why can't I see how you're behaving? You're shaking all over because you're scared, because you know I'm right." Sophia covered her face with her hands and sobbed. She understood that she could not convince him, that he would not back down, that her truth had destroyed him. Lucas clenched his fists. His breathing became heavy. He looked at her for a few more seconds. Then, with a sudden movement, he grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. "Where are you going?" Her voice was hoarse and filled with anxiety, but he didn't answer right away. He stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. His chest heaved with anger, his eyes burned with a cold flame. "I'm going to find out the truth further," he said firmly, then walked past her and disappeared behind the door, slamming it so hard that the house shook. Sophia was left standing in the empty kitchen, her breathing ragged and her eyes filling with tears. Panic began to boil in my chest. My hands trembled slightly. She knew this was the end, no matter how it turned out. Lucas, a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair and expressive eyes, had spent the entire night in his office, staring at his computer screen but not seeing a single line of code. His face looked haggard, stubble darkly covering his chin and cheekbones. Fatigue made him older, but what wore him down the most was the pain inside. He was here physically, but his thoughts were in another place, in another time, in memories of Sophia, about their years together, about the life they built together. A life that was now bursting at the seams. He felt betrayed, empty, as if there was a huge void inside him that nothing could fill. How could he not notice anything? How could he live side by side with her without suspecting that something was going wrong? Or did he just not want to see it? He ran his hand over his face and sighed tiredly. It seemed to him that the air in the room had become heavier, pressing on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He had always thought that their love was unshakable, that they had been through too much for anything to ruin their marriage. But now he felt like a stranger in his own life. Sophia was everything to him. He remembered the first time he saw her slender, with long dark hair, wavy and thick, which she liked to pin up at the back of her head. Her brown eyes always sparkled with enthusiasm, and her light, cat-like grace made her movements mesmerizing. Her smile could melt any ice, and her laughter could fill the space with warmth. He remembered how he looked after her, how he did everything to make her happy. Wasn't that enough? Was he a bad husband? Didn't he love her the way she deserved? Lucas dropped his head into his hands. My eyes burned with fatigue and pain. Frames from the videotape, her smile, her hand on the other man's shoulder were spinning in my head over and over again. He tried to find an answer, an explanation, but all he felt was a dull pain, eating away at him from the inside. It seemed to him that he no longer knew her, but perhaps he never really knew her. Lucas opened the profile of the man again, the same one whose name now sounded in his head like an annoying melody that was impossible to get rid of. Richard Davis. He wasn't some kind of playboy. He wasn't a Hollywood hunk with a perfect smile. On the contrary, he is an ordinary man, slightly older than Lucas, with sharp features, a slight stoop, and a completely ordinary style. Nothing in him betrayed a seducer, a man capable of destroying someone else's family. However, it was he who somehow captured Sophia's attention. Lucas glanced at the photographs. Richard posed next to his wife, a pretty but unremarkable woman, with his children and with his work colleagues. In one of the pictures, he stood in front of his office, an expensive car at hand, but there was not an iota of smugness in his face. He looked simple, a man who, it would seem, had to live his boring, routine life without any reason to seek adventure on the side. What did Sophia see in him? In Lucas's head, this question sounded with painful obsession. How could he be better? What made him more interesting, more attractive? Maybe he was more attentive. Did he tell her something that Lucas didn't? Maybe his words weren't lost in the rut their marriage was in. Lucas always thought Sophia was happy. They lived so many years together, shared so many moments. When did everything change? He remembered the evenings when they sat together, discussing plans for the future, how they laughed at stupid films, how they had long night conversations. When did it disappear? Perhaps it wasn't about the money. Lucas earned enough that their family didn't need anything. Not in appearance, he always believed that he kept himself in shape and never noticed any hints from Sophia of dissatisfaction with his appearance. Then what? Maybe he just stopped being important to her. Has it become commonplace? The thought burned him from the inside. He tried to find flaws in himself, but the more he thought, the more he plunged into the chaos of emotions. There was no answer. Only emptiness, irritation, and this suffocating feeling of uncertainty that was eating away at him from the inside. He had never felt so weak, so helpless. But he could not sit idle. If he wants an answer, he needs to do something. The solution will not fall into his hands just like that. He slammed his laptop shut and stood up. He felt his fingers trembling, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. This was not just betrayal. It was the destruction of his faith in love, in himself, in their family. No matter what happens, he won't let his life fall apart without a fight. He will find the truth, find out what's behind it. Lucas returned home in the morning when a gray dawn was already dawning outside the windows. The house was quiet, as if frozen in anticipation. He carefully walked into the bedroom, trying not to wake the children, and without undressing, sank onto the bed. My body ached from fatigue, but my thoughts continued to run endlessly. At some point, he closed his eyes and fell into an anxious, restless sleep. He woke up before everyone else. The room was in twilight, and from the street came the muffled noise of the awakening city. My head felt heavy, as if filled with lead, But there was no point in lying there any longer. He got up with difficulty, went into the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and went out into the corridor. Margaret was busy in the kitchen. She was often at their house, helping with little Theo, and had long become more than just a nanny for them. Her good-natured face lit up with a smile when she saw Lucas, but was immediately replaced by a worried expression. "Good morning, Mr. Lucas," she said, looking him over carefully. "You look tired. Did something happen?" Lucas smiled weakly, tightly, without real warmth. He knew that Margaret was perceptive, but he did not want to drag her into his problems. "It's okay, Margaret," he replied, walking towards the coffee machine. "I just didn't sleep well." She frowned, clearly not believing his words, but remained silent. Instead, she went to the stove, took the kettle off the heat, and poured herself a cup of tea. "Sometimes sleep doesn't bring relief," she said quietly, stirring with a spoon. "Sometimes the morning only adds questions." Lucas looked at her, but didn't answer. He took a sip of coffee, feeling the bitter liquid dispel the remnants of sleep, but not anxiety. He knew the day had just begun, and he knew that there were answers ahead of him that he might not want to know. Today was a day off, and the children decided to spend it together by having a family movie night. Luna suggested watching something from the classics. Sophia supported the idea, and soon the whole family gathered in the living room. Theo, like the smallest one, happily sat down on the sofa, waiting for the cartoon to start. Lucas sat down next to him, hugging his son, but his thoughts were far away. The film was on, but he could barely follow the plot. His gaze kept wandering around the room, skimming over familiar faces. Once upon a time, such moments were the happiest for him. He remembered how they laughed together, argued about which movie to choose, how Sophia leaned towards him, whispering something in his ear, and Luna grumbled if she was distracted. All this filled him with warmth, gave him a feeling of comfort and harmony. But now everything was different. Sophia looked tense. Her fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of the blanket, her eyes darting between the screen and Luca's, as if she were waiting for something inevitable. Luna, usually lively, looked thoughtful and distant, did not participate in discussions, and hardly smiled. Only little Theo played and laughed, not realizing that something had changed, that the atmosphere in the family had become different, filled with tension that could not be hidden. Lucas stole a glance at his wife. He knew it was hard for her. But was she heavy with guilt? Or was she afraid that the truth would come out sooner or later? He tried to decipher her expression, to understand what she was thinking about, but it was as if an invisible wall had grown between them. He took a deep breath, leaned back on the couch, and continued watching the movie. This day was supposed to be warm and family, but inside he felt a coldness that even the kindest movie could not dispel. The next morning, Luna left for school and Margaret took Theo for a walk. The house plunged into quiet emptiness. Sophia was at work, and Lucas finally had time to do what he had been thinking about all night. He walked slowly into the bedroom. My heart was beating heavily in my chest. He didn't want to do this, but he knew that there was no other way. He went to the closet, opened the doors, and froze for a moment. Here hung her dresses, neatly folded sweaters, her favorite perfumes on the shelf. It all still smelled like her. The smell awakened memories, warm evenings when she hugged him from behind, the whisper of her voice, light laughter. But these memories now burned. He gritted his teeth, reached out, and began methodically removing clothes from the hangers. Every movement was difficult, as if he was tearing apart not things, but his life. He carefully put her things into a suitcase, but inside everything was screaming in pain. He couldn't believe it was ending like this. When the closet was empty, he pulled out her linen and cosmetics from the chest of drawers and collected all the little things that reminded her of her presence in their home. He tried not to think, just move, because if he stopped, he might not be able to complete this. Finally, the suitcase was closed. Lucas exhaled and ran his hand over his face, feeling the emptiness inside him growing deeper. He picked up his things and carried them out into the corridor. They stood there as a symbol of his decision. He walked into the hallway, opened a desk drawer, and took out a new set of locks. He was going to change them before Sophia returned. This was his home, his family, and now there should be no room for betrayal in this house. Lucas sat at the kitchen table, tapping his fingers on his phone screen. His heart was pounding in his chest as he peered at the number he found. He found it on social networks, in a profile where a woman with a warm smile was holding a little girl in her arms. It was Emily Davis, Richard's wife. He didn't know what he would say. I didn't know where to start. But he knew one thing for sure: she must know the truth. He had no right to remain silent. Everything was boiling inside a mixture of anger, pain, and despair. How long did she live in ignorance? Did she even know anything? Lucas took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and pressed the call button. The beeps continued endlessly until finally someone answered. Hello? The woman's voice was soft, but a little tired. Lucas closed his eyes for a second, gathering his courage. Emily, this is Lucas. You don't know me, but I need to talk to you. This is important. This applies to your husband. There was silence on the other end of the line, then a cautious answer. What do you mean? Who are you? Lucas clenched his fist, trying to remain calm. I am Sophia's husband, and it seems to me that our spouses, he hesitated, but then decided, they are cheating on us. Silence. Lucas could almost hear her breathing hitch. This is some kind of mistake. Emily's voice trembled. Richard, he's not like that. I thought the same about my wife. Lucas smiled bitterly. But I have proof. Cameras, witnesses. I need to meet with you, personally, to discuss this. Emily was silent longer than he thought possible. Lucas could almost hear her breathing becoming ragged and her swallowing convulsively. How did you know? She finally asked. I was collecting information, he admitted. I tried to convince myself that I was wrong. But I can't do it anymore. I saw them meet. I saw her getting into his car. I heard lies. Oh my God. Her voice broke. I don't know what to say. We need to meet, he repeated. I don't know what to do next, but I need to know that I'm not going crazy. Emily fell silent again. When she spoke, her voice was already different, firm, decisive. Okay, she said. Today at 3. Cafe on Brook Street. Lucas felt the tension in his chest become almost unbearable. This was the beginning of the end, or the start of something new. Lucas squeezed the flash drive tightly in his hand, feeling its cold surface. He knew that what he was doing would change everything. However, doubts did not let him go. Maybe you should just forget, let go, start a new life without unnecessary scenes. But deep down he knew they deserved the truth. The car slid smoothly along the road, and thoughts rushed, colliding with each other. Anger gave way to fatigue, pain intertwined with determination. Cheaters should not get away with it. They betrayed trust and destroyed what had been built over the years. They thought that their secrets would remain hidden, that their lies would never come out. He exhaled, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. This is right, he repeated to himself. This is not revenge. This is justice. The city flashed outside the window, neon lights of signs, passers-by rushing about their business. It was a normal evening for all of them. But for Lucas, it's the moment of truth. When he turned onto the street leading to the cafe where they had agreed to meet, the tension inside became almost unbearable. This was the last chance to stop, last chance to change the course of events. But he had no intention of backing down. When Lucas entered the cafe, his eyes immediately found Emily. She sat by the window, leaning over a cup of tea, and looked thoughtfully at the street. The light fell softly on her face, emphasizing her thin cheekbones and delicate features. She had thick, wavy brown hair that fell in light strands over her shoulders, a neat nose, high cheekbones, and expressive lips. But what Lucas noticed most was her eyes. They were a deep brown shade, but they showed fatigue, pain, and perhaps even fear. She noticed him, straightened up, and quickly smoothed her hair, as if she wanted to look more confident than she actually felt. She smiled faintly as Lucas approached the table, but her fingers curled nervously around her cup. You are Lucas, right? She asked. Her voice was soft, but there was tension in it. Yes, he nodded, sitting down opposite. He placed the laptop in front of her, then took out a flash drive and inserted it into the port. At this moment, his heart started beating faster again. Now it was too late to retreat. Emily leaned forward, looking at the screen, and for a second her breathing became quieter. Lucas saw her shoulders tense, her fingers curl into a fist. At that moment, she seemed to have forgotten about the seagulls and everything else. She waited. "Are you ready?" he asked. Emily swallowed and nodded. Lucas pressed play. When the video ended, Emily closed her eyes and held her breath for a second. Lucas saw how her fingers trembled and how her lips pursed tightly. Then she took a deep breath and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said quietly, but there was so much bitterness in her voice that it almost sounded like an admission of guilt. "I've felt for a long time that something was wrong with Richard. He began to leave more often, became different. I asked, but he always found excuses." Lucas nodded. He knew this pattern all too well, lies disguised as care, false smiles hiding betrayal. "Now you have proof," he said, closing his laptop. "It's up to you to decide what to do next." Emily grinned, but there was no joy in her smile. "What about you? Have you already decided?" Lucas looked at her tired face, at her eyes, in which something more than just pain flashed. "I think so," he replied, "but I don't know how to do it yet." She nodded, as if she understood him better than he understood himself. Then she took her bag, threw on her coat, and stood up. "Thanks again, Lucas." This was important. She paused for a moment, as if she wanted to say something else, but changed her mind. "Take care of yourself." She turned around and left the cafe. Lucas remained seated, staring at the empty cup in front of him. He didn't know how much time passed before he finally stood up and headed towards the exit. But he knew for sure that the way back was already closed. When Lucas returned home, he immediately realized that Sophia was already there. Her suitcases stood in the corridor, just as he had left them. There was tension in the air, as if before a storm. Margaret opened the door for him. There was sympathy in her gaze, but she didn't say anything, just nodded silently and stepped aside. Sophia stood in the middle of the living room, pale, with wide eyes. There was panic in her face, her lips trembled. She nervously clutched the phone in her hands, as if she was looking for salvation in it. "What does it mean?" Her voice was broken, full of fear and indignation. "Why are my things on the street? Why were the locks changed?" Lucas felt rage well up inside him. He clenched his fists, trying to control himself, but when he met her gaze, his patience ran out. "What does it mean?" He mimicked her with contempt. "This means that you no longer live here, Sophia. Your new life is there, with Richard, so go see him." Sophia staggered as if struck. Her eyes filled with tears, but Lucas did not feel an ounce of pity. "Lucas, please, let me explain." "Explain?" His voice broke into a scream. "You already explained everything when you got into his car. You betrayed our family. You betrayed me. How dare you even ask anything?" Sophia sobbed convulsively and took a step towards him, but he sharply raised his hand, stopping her. "Go away," he said harshly. "Now." Margaret stood quietly to the side, not interfering. The house was no longer her home, and Lucas knew he would never let her be here again. Sophia burst into tears. Tears flowed down her cheeks, her voice trembled with despair. "Lucas, you don't understand. It's not what you think. Please let me explain." She took a step towards him, but he pulled back, as if her touch could burn him. "Not what I think," he shouted, his voice shaking the walls of the house. "Not what I think. You're lying to my face. I saw everything with my own eyes, Sophia. Cameras don't lie. Go to your Richard. Leave," she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. She didn't seem to believe that this was really happening. Lucas rushed to the front door, threw it open, and the cold night air rushed into the house. He pointed to the exit. "There, immediately." Sophia looked at him pleadingly, but there was no pity in his eyes. Only pain and rage. "Please, I'll fix everything." "Everything is already broken," he answered coldly. She stood still for a second, then, realizing that there was no other way out, She grabbed her suitcases with trembling hands and slowly walked out the threshold. Lucas slammed the door behind her. There was a deafening silence in the house. Sophia returned to her old apartment, the same one in which she lived before meeting Lucas. The small, cramped space with peeling walls and old wooden windows seemed even colder and empty than before. She went inside, closed the door, and leaned back against it. Her breathing was ragged, her heart was pounding in her chest. She looked around the room, dim, uncomfortable, alien. This was not her home. The house was the one she had just been kicked out of, where Luna and Theo remained. Where did he stay? Tears rolled down her cheeks, and she sank to the floor, exhausted. Sobs shook her body, her fingers clutched the carpet, as if she was trying to grab onto something that had long slipped away. She destroyed everything, herself, with my own hands. Remembering Lucas's look as he shouted at her, she winced. There was no doubt in his eyes, no hope, only rage and pain. She knew he wouldn't forgive her. Never. Sophia covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking from sobs. She thought she could fix everything. But now I understood that there was no turning back. Sophia sobbed, tears rolled down her cheeks, and a storm of emotions raged in her chest. She grabbed herself by the shoulders, rocking back and forth, as if this could at least a little relieve the pain that was tearing her apart from the inside. She tried to justify herself, tried to find an explanation for what she had done, but the more she thought, the more she realized that there was no excuse. It was a mistake, just flirting. I didn't mean to. She repeated in a whisper, as if convincing herself. But does that really happen? Does a person just ruin his life like that? Didn't she know what she was doing? Of course she did. She was aware of every step, every glance, every moment when she could have stopped, but did not. She allowed herself to cross the line beyond which there was no turning back. She wanted warmth, something new, those sensations that seemed to have long faded away. At some point, her family life seemed like a routine to her. Lucas became too predictable, too reliable, and she craved emotions, excitement, passion, and Richard gave it to her. Or was it just her imagination? Does she feel happier now that everything is destroyed? No. Now she feels only emptiness and despair. She didn't plan to destroy the family, didn't want to hurt Lucas, didn't think that the advances would develop into something more. But now everything had collapsed, and she knew that her mistake had cost her everything. She didn't just lose her husband. She lost his trust, his love. And with this, the feeling of security went away, the feeling that she had a home where she was expected and loved. She always dreamed of a strong family, of a home full of love and comfort. She remembered imagining their future, seeing herself and Lucas as old men sitting on the porch of the house, watching their grandchildren, and she had it. Everything she dreamed about came true, but she herself destroyed it with her own hands. Now, sitting on the floor in a cold, empty apartment, she could not understand why she had done this. Why did you betray the one you loved? After all, she used to be a decent, devoted wife. When did everything change? Where is the moment when she stopped appreciating what she had? Thousands of thoughts were spinning in my head. If only she could turn back time, if she could go back to that day when she first smiled at Richard a little longer than she should have. She wouldn't do that. She would turn around and leave. But now it's too late. It's too late. Sophia covered her face with her hands and burst into tears even more. My throat was constricted from sobs, my hands were shaking. The room was cold, but she didn't feel it. She felt only loneliness, which had now become her inevitable reality. The next morning, Sophia woke up with a heaviness in her chest. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her head was buzzing from a sleepless night. She felt empty, but most of all, she was tormented by one thing: silence. She tried to call Lucas, but every time her number rang. Not a single answer, not a single SMS read. She wrote to him again and again. Lucas, please talk to me. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I love you, I love our children. You don't even let me explain. Lucas, I am ready to do anything for you to forgive me, for the sake of our family. But there were no answers, only the emptiness of the screen that tore her heart. By noon, she could no longer just sit in her apartment. She was drawn to the house that had been her home just yesterday. She put on her coat without having breakfast and almost ran there. When she approached the door, her legs suddenly became weak. New locks. It was like a blow to the chest. He didn't just kick her out. He made it so she couldn't even enter, so that her keys won't fit anymore. This was the end that Lucas put in their story. Sophia stood in front of the door, breathing heavily. There was a struggle inside. Should I turn around and leave or try? Her fingers nervously clenched into a fist, then reached for the bell. But she couldn't press. She just stood there, looking at the door behind, which were her children, her life, her past. Several minutes passed before she plucked up the courage and, holding her breath, pressed the bell button. The door swung open suddenly, as if it had been ripped off its hinges. Lucas stood in front of Sophia, his eyes flashing lightning, his face distorted with rage. There was not a drop of warmth left in his gaze, only icy hatred and disgust. "What do you want here?" His voice was rough, cracking with anger. "Are you really so stupid that you don't understand that you're not welcome here?" Sophia shuddered, her lips trembled, and tears flashed in her eyes. She was prepared for a cold reception, but not for such open contempt. "Lucas, please." Her voice was weak, broken. I made a mistake. It was a weakness. I didn't mean to." "You didn't want to." He laughed bitterly, but there was nothing funny in his laughter. "You didn't want to get into his car. You didn't want to get into his bed. You didn't want to kiss him. Didn't want to caress him the way you once did me. You didn't want to lie to my face." Sophia sobbed convulsively, her shoulders shaking. "I was lost. I didn't have enough. Warmth. Attention. I don't know why I did it, but please, Lucas, believe me, I've always loved only you." He clenched his teeth, a look of disgust appearing on his face. "Did you love?" he hissed. "To hell with your love. You tore everything we had, with your dirty hands, with your stinking lust. You can't even imagine how disgusted I was to look at you when I found out the truth. How I hated every second I spent next to you. You are no longer my wife, you are just dirt under my feet." Sophia covered her face with her hands, her sobs became louder. She wanted to say something, but he was no longer listening. "Disappear. Get out of my life, bitch." And with these words, he sharply slammed the door in her face. Sophia remained standing on the threshold, crying choked out as the cold wind hit her face. She lost everything, finally and irrevocably. Several days passed, but the pain did not subside. Sophia felt empty, crushed. She couldn't come to terms with the fact that she had lost Lucas and her children. In desperation, she decided to turn to Margaret, the nanny who had helped their family for so many years. Margaret knew Lucas better than anyone, and perhaps could have stood up for her. They met in a small park not far from Lucas's house. Sophia arrived early, her hands trembling as she fingered the edges of her scarf while waiting for the nanny. When Margaret finally appeared, her face expressed cold calm, but there was disappointment in her eyes. "Thank you for coming," Sophia whispered, looking down. "I need to talk to someone." Margaret sighed and crossed her arms over her chest. "I don't know why I'm here, Sophia. If you're hoping that I'll talk to Lucas for you, you're mistaken." Sophia closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears. "I know I made a terrible mistake." Her voice trembled. "But please, you know how much I love children. I can't just disappear from their lives." Margaret shook her head, her gaze becoming even harder. "You betrayed the person who loved you more than anything in the world. You made the point yourself. Are you expecting Lucas to suddenly feel sorry for you, that he will forget how you betrayed him?" Sophia sobbed and reached out to Margaret, but she pulled away. "Please, talk to him, I beg you. Or at least tell him that I'm sorry." Sophia's voice broke. Margaret looked at her with a long, searching gaze. Then she shook her head. "No, Sophia, you must accept the consequences of your actions. Lucas doesn't need lies and empty apologies, and I don't need to be a part of it." Sophia lowered her head, feeling the world around her crumbling even more. "Forgive me," she whispered, but Margaret had already turned around and walked away, leaving her in cold solitude. Sophia continued to try to contact Lucas. Day after day, she wrote him messages, called him, hoping to hear his voice, but each time she was faced with indifferent silence. He removed her from his life, and this feeling was breaking her into pieces. She couldn't concentrate on anything. One day, she didn't even notice how the morning flew by and missed work. They called her from the office, but she did not answer. A meeting that was important for her project went ahead without her, and her colleagues began whispering behind her back. When she finally appeared in the office, looks full of curiosity and condemnation literally burned through her. "What's wrong with you, Sophia?" asked one of the employees as she stood absent-mindedly at the coffee machine, not even noticing that her cup had already been filled and hot liquid had spilled onto the table. "I'm just tired," she muttered, looking away. But no one believed her words. Sophia saw how they looked at her, how they discussed her behind her back. She was no longer the confident woman they used to see her as. Now she looked broken and lost. But the biggest blow was that Richard disappeared. She tried to call him, but his phone was switched off. Messages remain unread. It was as if he had disappeared from her life, as if they had never existed. Sophia sat in her apartment, clutching the phone in her hands, and realized that she was left alone. Absolutely alone. Sophia sat on the bed, clutching the phone in trembling fingers. She didn't expect an answer, but still tried again. This time the beeps did not stop, and after a few seconds an irritated voice was heard. "What do you want?" Richard sounded cold and distant. Sophia swallowed convulsively, trying to collect her thoughts. "Richard." Her voice trembled. "Why didn't you answer? I need to talk to you." "Listen, I'm busy. And frankly, I don't understand why you're calling me." He sighed heavily. "We're done, okay." Sophia froze, as if not believing what she heard. "Is it over? Are you serious?" Her voice broke. "You just decided to disappear? After everything?" Richard chuckled, but there was no warmth in his tone. "What did you expect? That we will live happily ever after? Sophia, you are too naive. It was fun, but now it's all gone wrong, and I don't want to deal with it." Tears welled up in her eyes. She grabbed the phone, squeezing it until her knuckles turned white. "I ruined my life for you, for our sake, and you just leave? Don't make me laugh," Richard chuckled. "For our sake? No, honey, you ruined your life for yourself. I didn't promise you anything, so don't try to blame me." Sophia closed her eyes, feeling how the whole world was completely collapsing. "I thought," she whispered, "I thought you loved me." Richard was silent for a couple of seconds, and then said indifferently, "I think it's time for you to grow up, Sophia. Goodbye." And the connection was broken. Sophia looked at the screen at the inscription, "Call completed." Richard left. He threw it away like an unnecessary thing, and she was left in the dark, lost and broken. It's been almost a month since Lucas kicked Sophia out. Time did not bring him relief, but he could not allow himself to become limp. Children were his main concern. He did his best to prevent them from feeling empty, but he saw that the changes affected them more than he expected. The moon has changed. She became quieter, more withdrawn, and stopped discussing her affairs with him, although previously she could talk for hours about school and her hobbies. Now her days passed in silence, and a certain heaviness settled in her eyes that was not there before. Theo, on the other hand, did not understand what was happening, but constantly asked about his mother. "Dad, will Mom come today?" he asked one day, climbing onto his lap. His big eyes looked with hope. Lucas stroked his son's head, squeezing the pain in his chest that he was trying to hide. "Mom is busy right now, baby," he answered softly, "but you can always talk to her or see her whenever you want." Theo nodded, but his smile faded as soon as he turned away. Lucas saw that the baby was bored, and it tore his heart. He might hate Sophia for what she did, but he couldn't cut her out of the children's lives. As much as he wanted to, he knew it was not his right. He only hoped that he could mend the wounds that their family had inflicted on itself. Margaret became not just a nanny for Lucas, but a real support. She cared for the children with a warmth that he himself sometimes lacked. On difficult days, it was she who helped Theo fall asleep when he was capricious or prepared Luna's favorite dishes to cheer her up at least a little. She kept the house in order, filled it with comfort, which was so lacking after Sophia left. Lucas saw how much she did and was eternally grateful to her. One evening, when the children were already asleep, they were sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea. The air was filled with the smell of fresh pastries that Margaret had baked after dinner and the light aroma of herbal tea. Lucas leaned his elbows on the table, looking thoughtfully at the cup in front of him, and then looked up at Margaret. The light of the lamp softly illuminated her face, which showed fatigue, but also kindness. "You're incredible," he said quietly, but with sincerity in his voice. "I don't know what I would do without you." Margaret smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "You could do it, Lucas," she answered softly. "You are a good father. Children feel your love, even if it seems to you that you are not giving them something." Lucas shook his head and exhaled, clasping his fingers together. "I try, but sometimes it seems to me that this is not enough. Luna has closed herself off. Theo keeps asking about his mother. I can't replace her with them, and it shouldn't." Margaret looked at him carefully, took a sip of tea, and put the cup down. "No, you shouldn't," she agreed. "But you can give them stability, love, and care. And that's what matters most. Children feel when there is support in the house. They worry, but over time the pain will subside if there is someone nearby who truly cares about them." Lucas smiled slightly, but there was still doubt in his eyes. "You sound like you went through something similar yourself." Margaret's gaze lingered on his face for a second, and then she shrugged slightly. "Life teaches us a lot," she answered quietly. "The main thing is not to be afraid to move on, even if it seems that everything is falling apart. I saw how people lose their families, how they lose themselves. But I also saw how they find the strength to build everything again." Lucas looked at her carefully, as if trying to figure out what she was thinking. For the first time in a long time, he felt understood, that there is a person nearby who not only feels sorry for him, but actually supports him. Sometimes I don't know what this new life should be like," he admitted. "Everything has changed so dramatically. I'm angry, tired, exhausted. Sometimes I feel like I don't recognize myself." Margaret smiled softly and covered his hand with hers. It was a gesture of concern, not pity. "You will recognize yourself, Lucas," she said confidently. "Just give yourself time." The silence of a cozy evening was suddenly broken by a quiet, sleepy voice. "What? Margaret will live with us now." Lucas and Margaret simultaneously turned to the doorway where Theo stood. His hair was tousled, his eyes were still half open, and he was holding his favorite soft toy in his hands. He rubbed his fist at his eyes and looked so defenseless that Lucas's heart sank painfully. Margaret smiled, but before she could say anything, Lucas beat her to it. "Why aren't you sleeping, little robber?" He reached out to his son, lifting him into his arms. Theo yawned and wrapped his arms around his neck. "I woke up and heard you talking," he muttered, clinging to his father. "And you didn't answer. Will it be?" Margaret lowered her gaze in embarrassment, but Lucas, looking at his son, realized that he had asked this question for a reason. Little Theo was looking for stability, looking for someone who would fill the house with warmth, and in his childhood mind, Margaret became part of their world. "Well, you know," Lucas ran his hand through his son's soft hair, "Margaret is always there when we need help." "But you won't kick her out, will you?" Theo looked at him with concern, then turned his gaze to Margaret. "I like it when you're here. You make the most delicious cocoa." Margaret smiled softly and patted Theo on the back. "I will always be there if you need help, I promise," she said in a warm voice. Theo sighed contentedly and snuggled up to his father again. "Okay then." Lucas and Margaret looked at each other. A shadow of tenderness flashed in Margaret's eyes, and Lucas suddenly had a strange feeling. A feeling that perhaps this woman had already become part of their family, even if he himself had not yet realized it. At dinner, there was a lightness unusual for recent months. Theo devoured the macaroni and cheese with gusto. Luna slowly picked at her plate with her fork, lost in thought, and Lucas and Margaret exchanged glances from time to time, sometimes serious, sometimes slightly mocking. Theo chatted incessantly, telling how his friend fell into a puddle in kindergarten, and then convinced the teacher that he was simply exploring the underwater world. Lucas chuckled, shaking his head, and Margaret laughed quietly. And suddenly Luna, who had been silent throughout the meal, raised her head and looked straight at Margaret. "Do you know that you bring warmth to this house?" she said seriously, as if she was weighing every word. Margaret froze with her fork in her hand, her cheeks turning slightly pink. She looked down shyly, but a warm smile appeared on her face. "Luna," she began, but the girl did not let her finish. "I'm serious. After everything that happened, you take care of us, cook dinners, help with Theo, talk to Dad when he's sick." Lucas looked at his daughter carefully, feeling something inside him shrink. He knew that Luna was having a hard time breaking up with her mother, but he didn't think that she was so sensitive to everything that was happening around her. Margaret looked at Lucas, waiting for his reaction. He smiled and covered her hand with his. "Luna is right," he said. "You have become a dear person to us." Margaret became even more embarrassed, but a warm sparkle flashed in her eyes. "Thank you, but I'm just doing what I can," she said quietly. "And we are grateful for that," Luna added, smiling sincerely for the first time in a long time. Dinner continued, but the atmosphere in the house was already different, warmer, filled with new meaning. And in Lucas's heart a feeling arose that he could not yet fully understand. One warm day, Lucas unexpectedly invited Margaret to take a walk with the children. He felt that the atmosphere in the house had become lighter, and he wanted to spend time together outside the usual walls. "It's been so long since we all went out together," he said, looking at Margaret with a slight smile. "Maybe we can go to the park. Theo will definitely be happy, and Luna will be able to unwind at least a little." Margaret thought for a moment, but then nodded. "That's a good idea," she replied. "I think we could all benefit from some fresh air." Theo, hearing about this idea, jumped for joy. "Hooray! Can I take the ball? Will there be ice cream?" His eyes burned with delight. "Of course it will," Lucas smiled. "Only if you promise not to eat two at once." Luna chuckled, but her lips twitched into a slight smile. She didn't mind, which was already a good sign. They got out into a large city park, where the sun played in the foliage of the trees, and the smell of freshly cut grass was in the air. Theo happily ran around the lawn, kicking a ball, and Luna and Margaret sat on a bench, talking. Lucas watched them from the side, and for the first time in a long time, his heart was calm. They laughed, ate ice cream, and walked carefree, as if they were a real family. At that moment, Lucas realized that such moments are the most valuable. He looked at Margaret, who was straightening Theo's hair with a smile, and suddenly found himself thinking that he did not want this to end. It was a cold winter day when Lucas, looking out the window at the slowly falling snow, realized that it was time to do something special for the children. Several months had already passed, and he saw how much they missed change, joy, something that would distract them from the past. He sat down at the kitchen table, where Margaret was doing her morning preparations, and, knocking his fingers on the wood, said thoughtfully, "I think we should go on vacation." Margaret raised her head in surprise. "On vacation? Where?" "I haven't decided yet, but somewhere where it will be warm and you can relax," Lucas said. "This will be the first vacation without Sophia. I want children to feel that life goes on." Margaret looked at him with gentle understanding and nodded. "That's a great idea," she agreed. "They really need something new, something joyful." Lucas was silent for a second and then looked straight into her eyes. "Will you join us?" Margaret froze, surprised by his proposal. She didn't expect this. "I? Are you sure?" "Of course," he smiled. "You have already become part of our family. The kids adore you, and I wouldn't want to go without you." Margaret blushed, but smiled back. "If you really want me there," she said quietly, "then I'll go with you." Lucas felt his soul become warmer. It was the right decision. Lucas decided that the best option for relaxation would be a trip to the mountains. A ski resort in Colorado seemed like the perfect place where they could get away from it all, enjoy the winter outdoors, and just spend time together. In addition, he knew that Theo would be delighted with the snow slides, and Luna would be delighted with the opportunity to retire in a snowy forest with a book. The journey took several hours. They drove along winding serpentines, watching the landscapes change outside the window. Green plains gave way to snowfields, and then tall spruce trees appeared, strewn with a white blanket. Theo pressed himself against the glass the whole way, enthusiastically looking at the snow-covered trees. "Dad, are we close yet?" He couldn't resist. "Almost, baby," Lucas smiled, checking the route. "A little more, and we will be in the house." When they arrived, a picturesque place lay before them, a cozy wooden chalet with panoramic windows overlooking snow-capped peaks. The inside smelled of wood and hot chocolate, and the fire crackled in the fireplace, creating a cozy atmosphere. The entire interior was done in warm wood tones, and in the center of the living room there was a large soft sofa, which Theo immediately climbed onto. "Wow," he exclaimed. "What is this, our house?" "Yes, baby, for a few days," Lucas smiled, placing his suitcases at the entrance. Luna walked slowly into the living room, looking around. She ran her fingers along the carved wooden table and gazed at the huge windows, behind which the snowy forest shimmered in the rays of the setting sun. Her face remained calm, but Lucas could tell from her eyes that she liked it here. Margaret took off her gloves and rubbed her palms, warming them. "It's amazing here," she said, looking out the window. "Pure snow, silence, a completely different world." Lucas looked at her, noticing how the winter light fell softly on her face. She looked different, relaxed, calm, even happy. He suddenly caught himself thinking that he was glad to see her like this. She had done so much for his family, and now she seemed part of this trip, part of something more than just a nanny. "Shall we go skiing tomorrow?" he suggested, looking up from his thoughts. "Yes," Theo shouted. "And on a sled, too. Can I go straight from the big slide?" "Only if I'm nearby," Lucas winked at him. Luna nodded, but her voice sounded calmer. "I don't mind, but I'll probably go for a walk first. I want to see what the views are here." "You can take the camera," Margaret suggested. "Such landscapes need to be captured." Lucas watched their conversation, feeling warm inside. He didn't know what this vacation would bring, but he already felt that it would change a lot. The evening passed in comfort. They sat by the fireplace, discussing plans for tomorrow. Margaret made cinnamon tea, Theo sat in a chair, wrapped in a blanket, and Luna leafed through the book, lazily turning the pages. The next day, the family went to the slope. The snow creaked softly underfoot. The air was fresh and invigorating. Theo ran around excitedly, swinging small ski poles, and Luna stood to the side, watching those around her, slowly getting out onto the slope. "Are you sure you don't want to try?" Lucas asked, adjusting his gloves. "Maybe later," Luna replied, turning away. Margaret sat down next to her, smiling. "If you want, I will help you," she said. Lucas, meanwhile, helped Theo fasten his boots. As soon as the boy was ready, he screamed joyfully and ran towards the small slope without waiting for instructions. "Theo, not so fast!" Lucas shouted, but it was too late. The kid, squealing joyfully, rolled down, but, not calculating the trajectory, at speed he crashed into a girl about his age, and they both fell into the snow. Lucas immediately rushed down the slope, Margaret behind him. "Theo," he said sternly, running up. "Are you okay?" Theo blinked in shock, then nodded, brushing snow off his jacket. "Sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to." Lucas turned his gaze to the girl, who had already sat up, rubbing her knee. She looked scared, but didn't cry. "Everything is fine?" he asked her. She nodded, but there was a slight confusion in her eyes. A man appeared nearby, apparently her father, looking at his daughter with concern. "What's happened?" he asked, glancing at Lucas. "Sorry, my son accidentally pushed her," Lucas said immediately. "I hope she wasn't too hurt." The girl's father looked at her. "How are you, honey?" "Everything is fine," the girl answered quietly, shaking off the snow. Lucas looked at Theo, who stood with his head down. He understood that his son did not do it on purpose, but he still had to explain to him the importance of caution. "Theo, what do we say when we hurt someone?" he asked softly but firmly. The boy raised his head, clenching his lips. "I'm sorry," he whispered, looking at the girl. She looked at him and nodded a little shyly. "Everything is fine." The evening turned out to be quiet. After a busy day on the slope, the children quickly fell asleep, tired from the fresh air and active games. Theo didn't even have time to finish listening to the story Margaret was reading to him, and Luna just curled up under the blanket, staring at the phone, but soon her breathing became even and deep. There was a pleasant silence in the house, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the fireplace. Lucas poured 2 glasses of red wine and sat down on the sofa, wrapping himself in a warm woolen blanket. Margaret sat down next to her legs tucked under her and her palms pressed against her glass, warming her fingers. "Today was a good day," she said quietly, smiling. The children were happy. Lucas nodded, taking a sip. Yes, they needed it. "I think we all needed this," he added thoughtfully, looking into the fire. Margaret looked at him more closely. Her eyes softly reflected the glow of the flame. "What about you?" she asked. "Did you need it too?" Lucas held her gaze a little longer than usual. He suddenly realized how naturally she fit into their lives. Her care, her patience, her kind laughter, all this became something important to him. "Yes," he finally answered. "I think yes." Margaret smiled and took a sip of wine. They sat next to each other, enjoying the moment of silence and comfort, taking their time to fill it with words. And in this silence, something new arose between them, barely perceptible, but real. Returning home after vacation turned out to be surprisingly pleasant. Instead of the usual emptiness that had haunted Lucas in recent months, he felt warm. The house no longer seemed cold and filled with the ghosts of the past. There was again the sound of children's laughter, the smell of freshly cooked dinner, and a feeling of comfort in the air. Lucas enjoyed this new feeling. He saw how Luna became a little more open, how Theo played carefree, no longer noticing the tension in the house. And he himself felt lighter, as if he had dropped a burden that he had been carrying for so long. There was no longer a feeling of emptiness. There was no longer that icy wall that had previously separated them. Margaret still helped with the children, but now something more appeared between them, barely perceptible, but real. The time spent in the mountains brought them closer, and Lucas began to notice how comfortable their communication became, how naturally she was able to bring warmth and care into their lives. And at this time, Sophia was sliding into the abyss. Life in her tiny apartment became increasingly unbearable. Every day was similar to the previous one, monotonous, filled with regret and emptiness. Memories surrounded her, the childhood toys she had once bought for Theo, photographs of them as a family, the smell of the perfume Lucas had once liked. It was all part of her past, which no longer existed. She tried to start over, but every evening, when she was alone, she realized again and again that she had lost everything. Lucas didn't respond to her messages, the children no longer called themselves, and even her friends gradually moved away. She was trapped by her own mistake, and there was no way out of this abyss in sight. Sophia sat in an empty office, clutching a paper with a notice of dismissal in her hands. Former colleagues were fussing around. Someone was whispering behind her back, but she heard nothing. Her heartbeat was dull and painful. It was inevitable. She missed work, didn't complete assignments, lost in her own despair, but seeing a black and white document with her name on it was like a blow below the belt. She slowly walked outside. The cold wind hit her face, but she didn't care. Memories sounded in my head: Theo's childish laughter, Luna's quiet voice, Lucas's kind eyes. How could everything fall apart like this? How did she get herself to this point? Without realizing how, she ended up at his house. The house that was once her home. She froze in front of the door, took a deep breath, and pressed the bell. Footsteps were heard inside, and a few seconds later the door opened. His mother stood in front of her. The woman looked at her coldly, without a drop of sympathy. "Lucas is not at home," she said firmly, "and even if he was, he wouldn't want to see you." Sophia swallowed, feeling a lump forming in her throat. Please, I just want to talk. I know I made a mistake. A mistake? Lucas's mother raised her eyebrows. A mistake is when you accidentally break a cup, and you destroyed the family, and now you don't belong here. Sophia took a deep breath, but she had already slammed the door in her face. She remained standing on the porch, feeling the cold penetrate her to the bones. But the realization burned even more strongly. She really had nowhere else to go. Sophia began to drown her pain in alcohol. At first, it was a glass of wine in the evening to drown out the melancholy a little. Then the bottle. Then something stronger. She stopped taking care of herself. Her once well-groomed hair became dull. Her clothes were sloppy, and her eyes became empty. Days passed in fog, nights in tears, and attempts to forget in another glass. She tried to call Luna. She so wanted to hear her daughter's voice, to feel that she had not yet been completely erased. But every attempt ended the same way. "Hello, Luna. How are you?" Sophia's voice trembled. "It's normal," the daughter answered dryly. I miss you. Maybe we can meet?" she asked hopefully. "I don't know. I have a lot to do." Luna fell silent, then added, "I'm busy right now, Mom." Bye. Horns. Sophia looked at the phone, feeling like another piece of her soul was crumbling into dust. She was a stranger in her family's life, and the more I realized this, the deeper I plunged into the darkness that I had created for myself. One evening, when Sophia had already finished another bottle of wine, the doorbell rang. She reluctantly rose from the couch, staggering, her head buzzing from the alcohol. Who could come? No one looked for her anymore, no one called, no one wanted to see her. When she opened the door, Richard stood in front of her. But this was not the confident, well-groomed man she once knew. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and he smelled unpleasantly of fumes and something musty. The eyes turned red, and a crooked smile froze in the corner of the lips. "Hey, baby," he muttered, grinning. "Aren't you glad to see your old friend?" Sophia grimaced. Fury flared up inside. He dared to come to her like this? When did he leave her? When did he cut her out of his life? "What do you want?" she muttered through her teeth. Richard grinned, leaning against the doorframe. "I thought I'd drop by. Let's talk. I see you're not in the best shape either." He looked at her with a drunken look, lingering on her disheveled hair and shapeless sweater. Sophia felt everything boiling inside. She wanted to slam the door in his face, but instead she stood and looked at him, realizing how low they had both fallen. Richard pushed the door open and walked inside without even asking permission. Sophia clenched her teeth, watching him awkwardly sink onto her old couch, rubbing his temples. "Damn," he muttered, sighing tiredly. "I'm sorry that everything didn't work out as we planned." Sophia chuckled, feeling anger flare up inside her. "Did you plan?" How dare he speak as if they were a victim of circumstance and not their own choice? "You left me, Richard," she muttered through clenched teeth, "after I lost everything. You knew that I had nowhere to go, you knew that I was in pain, but you didn't even look back." Richard looked up at her with a dull, irritated look. "Do you think it was easy for me?" His voice became rough. "You're not the only one who lost everything, Sophia." She clenched her fists. Anger seethed inside her, bursting out. "It's all because of you, Richard," she screamed. "If it weren't for you, if it weren't for your damn promises." His lips curled into a scornful grin. "Don't be a fool, Sophia. You made your own choice." Sophia was shaking with rage. Her gaze darted to the bottle on the table. In a second, she grabbed it, lifted it above her head, and smashed it forcefully against the edge of the table. The fragments scattered to the sides, and she, breathing heavily, squeezed the neck in her hand, looking at him with fury in her eyes. "Go away," she hissed. "Now." Richard raised his hands, retreating towards the door. A shadow of fear flashed in his eyes, but he still tried to maintain a mask of indifference. "To hell with you," he said before stepping over the threshold. When the door slammed, Sophia slowly sank to the floor, feeling her hands trembling treacherously. She hated him, but she hated herself even more. The next day, Sophia was found by a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman. She was walking up the stairs with a bag of groceries when she noticed that the door to Sophia's apartment was slightly open. This alarmed her. Sophia had been looking torn lately, but she never left the door open. "Sophia," she called, carefully pushing the door open. What she saw made her heart clench with horror. Sophia lay on the floor among broken glass shards. Her hand was cut and her eyes were closed. An empty bottle lay nearby, and the heavy smell of alcohol hung around the room. Mrs. Henderson gasped and wasted no time in rushing to the phone. "Oh my God," she whispered, dialing the ambulance number with trembling fingers. "We need to send someone urgently. The girl, she's bleeding." The dispatcher's voice was clear and collected, but it felt like the seconds were dragging on forever. She returned to Sophia, gently touched her shoulder, checking her breathing. It was faint, but it was still there. "Hold on, girl," she said quietly, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "Help is on the way." An ambulance siren broke the morning silence. Sophia slowly opened her eyes. The light was dim, but even it hurt the eye. My head was buzzing, my body felt heavy, and there was a faint smell of antiseptics in the air. She tried to move, but a sharp pain in her arm made her groan. "Don't move," said a familiar voice. She blinked, focusing on the silhouette that sat next to her bed. It was Lucas. His face was tired, dark circles under his eyes spoke of a sleepless night, but his gaze was firm. "You," Sophia's voice trembled. Her dry lips barely moved. "What are you doing here?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He looked at her with a mixture of emotions that she couldn't make out. There was disappointment and anger in his eyes, but somewhere deep down there was a faint glimmer of pain. "Someone had to come," he said dryly, intertwining his fingers in his lap. "A neighbor called an ambulance, and they found my number in your phone." Sophia looked away. Everything inside tightened. She wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in her throat. "I didn't think you," she swallowed, "that you would even want to see me." Lucas clenched his jaw, stood up and walked around the room, as if trying to control his emotions. "And I didn't want to," he finally answered. "But damn it, Sophia, what happened to you? I don't recognize you." She clutched the sheet, feeling the tears sting her eyes. She didn't know what to answer him, because the truth was so ugly that even she herself could not look at it. After being discharged from the hospital, Sophia firmly decided to pull herself together. She couldn't afford to fall any further. Life was crumbling before her eyes, but now that she was at the very bottom, she had only one way up. The first step was to make an appointment with a psychologist. She hesitated for a long time, but sitting in a small office with warm light and soft chairs, for the first time in a long time, she felt that she was being heard. Conversations with the therapist were difficult, but Sophia knew that she needed to go through this path. At the same time, she began looking for work. Most of the good jobs required experience that she didn't have, but she didn't give up. In the end, she managed to find temporary work in a small cafe. It was far from what she had done before, but the work gave her a purpose and helped her take her mind off difficult thoughts. She tried to put herself in order slowly, step by step. I cleaned the apartment, got rid of empty bottles, and regained the habit of taking care of myself. Every morning I forced myself to get up earlier, go for a run, and breathe fresh air. It was difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she had the feeling that she could still fix something. She knew that Lucas would never come back. He moved on, built his life, in which there was no place left for her. But her children, they were still a part of her only hope. Sophia knew she had lost their trust, but if she had any chance of winning it back, she had to try. She started writing messages to Luna, not demanding an answer, just talking about her life, that she was trying to become a better person. She asked how they were doing without intruding, but making it clear that she was there, that she still loved them. So far, the answers have been rare and short, but Sophia did not give up. She hoped that one day Luna and Theo would be able to call her mom again with the same love as before. At the same time, Richard's wife, Emily, did not sit idly by. She patiently collected evidence, thought through every step, and waited for the moment when she could strike. She wasn't going to just walk away, leaving everything they'd spent years building in the hands of the man who betrayed her. Documents, checks, bank statements, correspondence, hidden payments, she meticulously collected all this, creating an unshakable basis for divorce. She had lawyers, she consulted with financial experts, and when the time came, she filed for divorce, accompanied by a detailed account of his machinations. Richard was stunned. He believed that everything was under control, that Emily would not know about anything. But now his bank accounts are frozen, his property is under threat of division, and his wife's lawyer wanted him to leave with nothing. "You won't leave me with nothing," he shouted, rushing into the house that was no longer his. Emily stood before him calmly, reservedly, with an icy glint in her eyes. "No, Richard," she answered coldly. "You left yourself with nothing." She knew she would no longer be in the shadow of his lies. Now he was reaping the consequences of his actions, and she could finally move on. Sophia was returning from the store, holding a small bag of groceries in her hands. The cold wind penetrated her to the bones, but her thoughts were occupied with something completely different. She tried not to dive into the past, not to think about what she had lost, but to simply move on with her life. But when she approached her entrance, a familiar voice stopped her. "Sophia." She froze. Luca's mother stood in front of her. There was determination in her gaze, but also a drop of fatigue. "We need to talk," she said firmly. Sophia swallowed, clutching the bag in her hands. "About what?" "About Lucas. About the fact that you need to finally let him go." The woman narrowed her eyes. "Give him a divorce." Sophia felt how everything inside her tightened. Does he want this?" "He's wanted this for a long time," Lucas's mother replied. "Things are finally starting to look up for him. Do you know that Margaret takes care of the children, that she is always there, that they became a family? Don't ruin it." Sophia looked down. She knew that this meeting would happen sooner or later, but hearing these words in person was painful. It hurts like hell. The divorce went quickly. Sophia didn't resist. She knew Lucas needed to move on. The documents were signed, and their paths officially went their separate ways. But despite this, she did not give up trying to get closer to the children. At first, Luna answered dryly. Theo was wary, but over time the walls began to crumble. Sophia did not demand anything. She was simply present in their lives. She wrote messages, was interested in their affairs, and invited them to meetings. Small steps led to the fact that one day Luna called her herself. Then Theo started telling her about his toys and sharing stories. It was slow, painful, but she had something worth living for again. And Lucas. He was in no hurry. He did not look for a replacement, did not try to force anything to be built. Everything happened naturally. Margaret remained close, and gradually their friendship grew into something more. It was not a flash of passion, it was a warm, calm feeling based on trust and support. And when one day he took her hand, none of them were surprised. Life moved on. Sophia learned to live with the consequences of her decisions, but now she did not destroy herself, but tried to build something new. Lucas found his happiness, and the children gradually accepted the new reality. It wasn't perfect, but maybe that's how it was supposed to be. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. 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 Click to the next one.